Good. So my lesson today is going to be probably different from all the others of this school, but I hope this will be interesting. And it's certainly way different from Julia's one. I guess it's easier. I hardly believe it can be more difficult. So that's an easy task. Um, but maybe you are not, at least not many of you are familiar with psychophysiological measurements, which is my previous work, I would say. And my background is in neuropsychology, neuroscience, and for many years. And I worked quite a lot with the skin conductance, especially, but also with heart rate. So I will give you this introductory lesson about psychophysiological measurements, focusing especially on skin conductance and heart rate measures. So let's start. And I'm happy yesterday Juliette mentioned many psychophysiological measures as a good measure or typical measure that can be taken for longitudinal studies. They can be also used in standard non-intensive longitudinal studies. And but yeah, I was happy because you can see that it's not a topic for neuroscience, it's a topic for psychologists. Because why? Why? Because psychophysiological measures are bodily response, basically are something that you can measure from a response to your physical body to a psychological manipulation. Okay, so that's how we define psychophysiological measurement. So you do something that activates somehow the nervous system by manipulating some psychological variable, and you measure a physiological response from the body. The positive side of these measurements, or at least how people prefer to defend the positive side because they are arguable, is that the objectivity. What does it mean? It means that they typically do not depend on the will or any active response by the participants. I say typically because you can train somehow people to control also psychophysiological measurements, but your typical participants are not trained in controlling it, but you could ideally train people to control the heartbeat and also the sweating somehow, to some degree. So, but ideally they are objective measurements. Multidimensionality in terms that you can have multiple indices from one recording. So, for example, if you measure epoch response potential from the brain activity, which is a psychophysiological measurement, you can have multiple indices to understand what is happening. So you may have different phases of looking at the same response to the same stimulus. I don't know how to pronounce this, unobtrusiveness. It's basically that you are not asking to do something else to measure a thing, so you are not introducing any other task to do to measure one thing. You just record the response from the body. This is connected to implicitness, so you don't require an overt performance from your participants, typically. Sometimes you do, because also electromyographic responses of preparing an action can be a psychophysiological measurement, but you can have also the preparation to this. So maybe you can say, and I did sometimes, you can ask, okay, imagine to grasp this object, okay? Imagine to grasp an object reactivates your muscle activities, and you can record without doing it. Okay, so you can have these responses that are over. And the other good point is that theoretically you can have this continuous measurement, which is good for intensive, for example, longitudinal studies, but generally speaking, it's good for your parametric assessment, that every time you want to estimate a parameter, it's good that it's supposed to be really continuous. Then it's not, because you have to digitalize, of course, but this depends on the sampling rate. We will see this probably. But ideally, it's a continuous measurement. Are they always good? No, not at all. It depends on what you want to do. There are many drawbacks, and we will see, but general drawbacks of these are that you need special equipment to do it. It's not just I have this idea and I do my experiment, because you need amplifiers and instruments to record um, these data, and sometimes these can be expensive, or they need maintenance, they need special, they have special needs basically. Um, Data acquisition and interpretation can be very difficult and again arguable. Why is it so? Well, typically these are very weak electrical signals, what you are measuring. That means that you need to amplify them a lot. That means that you may have a lot of noise. You may have many indices with many levels that you can twitch and adjust. And if you want to get something, it's easy to get something if you really want it. So uh, and the interpretation of the data also is quite, it's not always straightforward. I mean, I will show you for these two measurements that we are focusing on, that for a few indices we know exactly what they mean, but sometimes you don't. For example, one thing that people will avoid to tell you is that we don't really understand what is an evoked potential from the ERP, so from the brain activity. For many reasons, we really don't get why we have these ERP responses, and so it's debatable why you have the different components you assume that are associated with some specific brain activities, but it's still debatable. But that's something that is used since the 60s. Okay, so okay, we always did it this way. It's fine. And the other drawbacks is their naturalness. I mean, it's true that it's a little intrusive, but still you are applying electrodes to people. Sometimes this constrains movements. Ideally, also the MRI is a psychophysiological measurement. Imagine to measure anxiety inside a scanner with something 3 centimeters from your nose, with a very heavy noise around your head. I mean, that's not really natural, okay? But it's not neither really natural if I tell you, okay, I'm measuring your heartbeat with these 7 electrodes, but let's say with the 7 electrodes attached, you have to remove your shirt, so you have to stay, I mean, almost naked. It's not so natural. So some of the assumptions about the ecological and natural and not intrusive are true, but not complete. Which measure? What can you measure? Well, you can measure what we said, that whatever response measured from the body is a physiological response to something, and so you can have a measure for whatever response that you can catch. That means you can have event-related potential, you can measure muscular activities, you can measure sweating of the skin, you can measure heart rates, you can measure blood pressure, you can measure whatever you want. And ideally, these are all psychophysiological measures. Some of them have very specific fields, for example, EEG, so electroencephalography, and related ERP as it's their own field, so you don't typically refer to it like psychophysiology, but like EEG, okay? And the same for MRI. That's why I'm saying this, because when you speak or you read in papers about psychophysiology, typically you refer to the autonomous nervous system response, which is a specific part of the nervous system. It's not all the nervous system, but it's also related and mediated by the activity of the central nervous system, but it reflects the activity of the peripheral and of the autonomous nervous system. This can be measured still at many levels, so you can have, for example, responses that can be reading the eyes, like open dilatation, or you can have a breath rhythm. You can have all the different organs, and with all, I mean all, also the lower part. There are papers that measure intimate parts responses for measuring the autonomous nervous system. I didn't get why, because the autonomous nervous system is an all or nothing response, and so if you have a sympathetic response, it impacts all the different parts of the sympathetic response. So if you measure from your penis or from the skin conductance, it's the same. you are measuring still the same response. So you can be more or less intrusive. If you want to measure basic responses, it's good, but if you want to measure psychological reaction to attractiveness of faces, you can measure with skin conductance, and you don't really need all the others. You can only measure one for the sympathetic or one for the parasympathetic. Yes.
Is it the case that every time you have a skin conductance variation, you also have all the other types of variation of skin conductance?
Yes, but as you can see from the slide, I wish to be able to use the whiteboard, but that means that I will be able to draw the whole nervous system. You can see that you can have multiple innervations from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So that means that it's not a correlation one-to-one because they receive different inputs, but the idea is that if you have discharge of the sympathetic response, this will impact all the line of the sympathetic response. Okay? That's also good to know because that's why you can measure from wherever you want the skin conductance. If I'm stimulating one hand, I can record from the feet, from the neck, from the forehead, wherever I want, because it's a full body reaction. You can train again how to control the general response, but it's a general response. Once you have it, you have it. Yeah, and we may discuss what does it mean this. But yeah, the orgasm, that's why you feel relaxed and aroused. Because it receives input from both sides, and that's why it's so pleasant. So we will focus on skin conductance and heart rate. First, because I'm a little more expert than the other, I use quite a lot, especially the skin conductance, so I can tell you more. But the other part is also because they are the two most frequently used, I would say, together with the pupil dilatation. Pupil dilatation is often used when you have eye trackers, because you can both track the movements and the pupil dilatation. So you have indices of voluntary movements and of the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. So that's the other very frequently used measure of the autonomous nervous system. But the others, you can measure whatever you want, but usually you don't, because they are more complex for collecting the data. So I start with the skin conductance, and then we will see the heart rate. And both presentations are more or less, well, are together, of course, but they are one parallel to the other. So first we see what we can do, the physiological basically part of the measure, how we can measure, some tricks to set a reliable experiment. So a few tips to start your first experiment with it, and the potential drawbacks and what you have to care when you design your experiments. So the disclaimer is that I tried to make a brand-free presentation, but it's almost impossible in the sense that you really depend on the machine that you are using. Okay, so I did my best to present as less as possible brands in the presentations and present the general aspects, but you always have to stick with the indication of the brand that selling the machine. That means the principles are true for everyone, but the specifics depends on the specific machine that you have. And unluckily, I used many different machines, so I had to learn how to use many different machines, and every time it's a new stuff. So what is the skin conductance? The skin conductance is a momentary change in the electrical potential of the skin that can be evoked by a wide variety of stimuli. So basically, you are measuring how much are you sweating. That's it. That's what skin conductance measures. And your sweating is measured as an increased or decreased in the conductivity of your skin. Okay? Under normal condition, when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, you fill this space, okay, with sweat, and basically, as we know, water is a good conductor, so you increase the water light, and that means that you conduct better electricity. Okay? That's quite simple. The alert is for the different terms that you find in the literature that can be considered the same. They are not exactly the same, but frequently people that use it as a synonym. So maybe they are used in other words in improper way, because sometimes they use general electrodermal activity. The general electrodermal activity means everything related with the skin conductance, but you can have galvanic skin response because it's related to the person who found this conductivity of the skin. You can have skin response, sympathetic skin response. You can have many ways to write it, but it's always the same. Sympathetic response to spectrum. So the neurophysiology behind the skin conductance is that electrodermal responses are automatic responses mediated by the sympathetic division, only the sympathetic division. Okay, we'll see what sympathetic division does. Is the part of the peripheral nervous system that regulates all the visceral responses, the sympathetic, and basically it responds to activation. So it's a measure of arousal, how much you are aroused, activated. So if something for the fight or flight, let's say. The autonomous nervous system innervates three types of tissues, which are the glands, smooth muscles, and the heart, which is red muscles, but it works like white one. That's something too much. Okay, so these are a separation more or less of the two systems that are somehow imbalanced, because this is for the when you are aroused, so you have to be activated to respond to a stimulus that could be a threat, could be also pleasant, we said just before, but it's something that makes you increase your alert response. While the parasympathetic, somehow it's something that is typically activated when you are at rest, relaxed, and you are the opposite of activated, okay? These two works in balance. In perfect condition, if you activate one, you deactivate the other, but we see that there are situations where you have both systems activated, so it's not a perfect balance, but they typically work this way. So for example, the pupil that is innervated both by parasympathetic and sympathetic responses delays for the sympathetic activation and contracts in case of the parasympathetic response, okay? So that's why people say that when you see something that you like, someone that you like, you have this dilation of the pupil, not because you are relaxed because you like it, but because you are aroused and you are activated and you are in an alert situation for a pleasant reason. So again, it's separated from the balance, it's just activation, it's arousal, it's not positive or negative, it's I have energy, okay, I have to do something, I want to do something, while the parasympathetic is, okay, I can relax, I can rest now. I think it's useful to introduce very little of the history of these measures, because psychologists have been almost always looking for objective responses that should not be mediated by the respondents. And this is something that has been done also very early with the skin conductance and the autonomous nervous system response. So the first observation is from 19th century, late part, basically when psychology was taking birth. But yeah, at the beginning, it wasn't really clear what these kind of responses were. And looking for understanding it, we very recently developed studies investigating which brain areas can be related to autonomous nervous system responses. Why? Because the latency for carrying the stimulus from the periphery to the central nervous system is super fast, it's very fast. And the latencies are typically quite slow for the psychophysiological measurement. That means that it depends from the descending path. So after the stimulus has arrived, I have to process it and to react to it. So it's true that it's an autonomous nervous system response that many times is unrelated to the central nervous system response, but it can be also dependent from central nervous system responses. And which part of the central nervous system regulates this descending path of the autonomous nervous system? Well, for how much can be this reliable, the best guess is what is called anterior cingulate cortex, which is a part of the brain in the frontal region that has been shown that it inhibits, when it's lesioned, patients do not show normal response to in their autonomous nervous system responses. And it has also been shown that this is correlated to, in healthy people, to the activities of the autonomous nervous system. So there are not very stringent evidence that is this part the only one responsible for it, but it's very likely to be related to autonomous nervous system response. And this part is known to be, or to reflect and to be particularly activated in the case of, again, cardiovascular sympathetic activity, that means heart and skin conductance, but also to physical and cognitive efforts, which means that if you ask to do a task with a high cognitive load, this activates also the sympathetic and parasympathetic response. That's why you can use it also to measure cognitive tasks. Okay, you can use the skin conductance to measure how much difficult is, for example, a working memory task. Because the higher the load of the task, the stronger the response of the same area that is related to also activates the autonomous nervous system. And it's also it's been shown that it's associated with the emotional experiences. So that's why most frequently you use to measure psychophysiological responses as measured for emotional growth. Yeah.
Emotional experiences in general?
Whatever. Yes. Whatever activates your emotion responses. We don't have this level of detail. Yeah. It could be interesting to see if you have only for positive or negative, but again, it's a matter of arousal, that psychophysiological measure. So it makes sense that if you can provide higher arousal picture, let's say, that stimulate positive or negative, what it's measuring is the arousal of these pictures and not the balance. That's the point is that it's not related to balance. So again, we have a few historic big pieces of evidence that suggest that this could be a useful piece of information for us. Classics like Pavlov already showed that you can have this kind of generalized response. Sokolov showed that you have this as a part of a more general response of orientation. So for example, if you do a very strong noise, and that's a way to measure it, unexpected, you have this orientation response that it drives all the orientation system towards the source of the noise, and you have this. As part of response, you have also a sympathetic response. And interesting to me also, because it tells you who did it, it's the work by Jung. Jung is not certainly known to be an experimental psychologist, but he was probably a little bit in his life, like Freud. It comes from neuroscience, although people don't always remember that. He tried to explain from a neuroscientific perspective some things that could change maybe. But also Jung tried to do it, and he measured basically skin conductance responses for association between words, and that's one of the first earlier evidence that you can have psychophysiological responses to something that is purely cognitive somehow. So it happens only in your mind. There's no external stimulation. I tell you a word, but you respond to that with your internal. It's all internally generated, let's say. And of course, this has been attractive, especially in a few contexts that could be used as a lie detector. And although I really think it's bad, think that you can use it as a lie detector, because you can't. First, you can train. So if you really want to lie and you use this as a lie detector, you can be trained to not have a response to it. But yeah, secondly, it also makes ethical questions about the rights of life or not, and have this kind of measure. But besides this, it was very useful because this brought a lot of attention to the techniques and a lot of basic studies to really understand the meaning of the skin conductance and what you can actually measure with it. The end point is that it's not a good lie detector, although in the US sometimes together with other instruments is used and also in trials it has been used. But yeah, it's not reliable enough, let's say, to conclude that it's a good lie detector. But that's good because we, as a researcher, have a lot of basic studies to understand the nature of the signal. So, psychogalvanic, I also, sorry, used many synonyms of this stuff, can be seen as the easiest way, in my opinion, to approach psychophysiology, in the sense that it certainly is the easiest way that you can measure. It's a single line with only one really reliable index, and I will tell you which one is it. So it's okay, you have to know some things to really use it, but once you know these things, then it's not that complicated to manage the skin conductance measurement. Why it can be very complex if you want to measure EEG signal and all the process that you can do on those data, you cannot do it on the skin conductance, which means that it's a very raw response of the sympathetic activity, and all the time people want to decompose the skin conductance. Don't trust that study that much because we only know what's the peak of the skin conductance means and not all the other forces that have been decomposed. Not deeply enough, at least. Yeah.
What are those
Yeah,
marks?
I'll show you in a few seconds. Yes. Sorry, yeah, no, I don't remember where I did put it, but let's say that the skin conductance is one index of conductivity of the skin. So the measurement that you have as an absolute zero, which is you don't conduct anything, and it can go to plus infinite, hypothetically. But that's it, what you measure. But that measure has different phases and depends on different rates, because you can have circadian cycles, and what you are interested in doing research is not on the daily cycles that depends on not central related activity of the nervous system. Okay, that's why I introduced it to psychophysiology, because your response depends on the activity of the central nervous system, but also of the autonomous nervous system that works by itself. And when you do research, you are interested in the fast response, that is the response to an event-related responses. And so you want to filter out all those cycles and the rhythms that do not depend on the activity evoked by your stimulus. And these studies, the basic studies related to the lie detectors, showed us that we have a very a clear window where this can happen in response to a stimulus. And we will see, I will show you the timing, but the idea is that you need to filter out the cycles that are not dependent on the evoked stimulus. And that's why you can derive what is called skin conductance response. So the response of the skin conductance to evoked stimuli is the SCR from the skin conductance level, which is the actual real measure of your skin. Okay? And I show you how you do that. But the idea is that you have one measure, but actually you really derive two measures, the skin conductance level and the skin conductance response. As a researcher, you are typically interested in the skin conductance response, and but you have to take care that exists because of the skin conductance level. So again, each skin conductance response is characterized by several potential parameters. Why I say potential? Because as I told you, from basic studies, we are quite sure that the peak response is related to arousal. So we have basic evidence that show that this is related to the activation of the sympathetic response, of the sympathetic activity, also studying all the different measures of the sympathetic response. You saw that the peak is related to it, but the latencies, for example, we don't really know. There are no clear evidence of what generates a later or a shorter latency. You may have different measures like the slopes, okay, so how fast you increase your skin conductance, but again, we are not very sure if this is related to a sympathetic activation or not. So there are papers that try multiple indices and pick the one that work. I shouldn't say that. I should say they have different opinions on which indices works the best. But basic studies show that we know that the peak is a response to sympathetic activation. All the other indices, we don't know. Maybe yes, but we don't know. Okay? Physiological, yes. The idea is that you want to measure the physiological response to that stimulus, and the physiological response that is certainly, almost certainly, related to a physiological reaction of the sympathetic nervous system is the peak.
You want to know the mediating physiological mechanism before you.
Yeah, that's what I will. Yes. That's what I wish to know before saying latency is a good index to keep and to measure it. It's the same example of the skin conductance level. If you don't know that you have these circadian cycles, you don't need to have the skin conductance response. Why you should think of it? You just need, okay, it's higher here at this point, and I take it. But you have cycles that last like 5 seconds, like 10 seconds, that are not related to sympathetic activation from the central nervous system. So yeah, that's
because there could be systematic differences between types of stimuli and types of slope.
Yes. Yes, there could be, but we don't know what is generating that systematic changes and from where it's originating and why it should be so. And typically these kind of experiments don't have very reliable powers, so if we rely on results that are significant because you don't know the underlying mechanism, I mean, I would say at least twice. At least. But we will reach that point because we have many problems with it. So that's the part of the better safe than sorry tips about the skin conductance. So things that it's better to know in advance, because you can't imagine how many times people come to me saying, okay, I did this experiment and because it's easy to collect, I also collected the skin conductance. What can I do now? Nothing. Because maybe they use stimuli every second. If you have a stimulus each second, you're not measuring the skin conductance. You are measuring noise. Okay? So this is the kind of tips that I wish to show you, also to trust what you read and not just to run your own experiments. So we have evidence that we have a large intra and inter-individual variability, either for the latency of the responses and for the amplitude, especially for the inter-individual variability for the amplitude. For example, you may have different latency of the beginning of the response that can range from 1 second to 3 seconds. Okay, I give you a stimulus. You can almost always discard all the responses that start earlier than 1 second from the stimulus. This also gives you a large time window to do whatever you need with your software to have triggering without super precise computer-based experiments. For example, you can trigger stimulus with your hands because, I mean, you have 1 second to be sure that you sign the trigger of the stimulus without being precise at the millisecond level. But if you have this information, you can also exclude all the responses before 1 second because we know that we do not generate skin conductance responses earlier than 1 second. Then you have a 1 to 3 second latency to begin the response, and you may have a response that lasts like 2, 3, 4 seconds. Okay, so the idea is that latency again is not very reliable, but you have to set large enough time windows to be able to observe your response. My suggestion is exclude the first second and then go up to 5 seconds if you have very precise timing for the stimuli. For example, you give a picture on the screen, you know exactly when it happened, so 5 seconds is enough because we know that after 3 seconds you start to decline your response. But if you don't have this precise, for example, you are having a less precise experiment, or you are giving, for example, you see, okay, read this sentence, and maybe you don't exactly know when the person reached the point that is of your interest, you can extend the time window up to 10 seconds. After 10 seconds, you are almost always sure that any response later than 10 seconds from your stimulus is not generated by your stimulus. Yes?
I wonder if you can distinguish between the stimulus that is presented for 1 second, as you measured after. The stimulus is presented for 5 seconds. Can you measure after? What I mean is that is there a cumulative component? Is it a stable? Or you don't know?
You don't know. That's the point. That could be a situation where that is not good for the skin conductance response, because you don't know when you generate the response. It's as soon as you see the picture and you have an all or nothing response, so you generate the response and that's it, or it's a cumulative effect that maybe for the first second you don't care because you didn't notice that it's an emotion. Let's say it's a picture where there's a gun. Okay, you didn't notice the gun as soon as it appears, but after 1 second, because it's there, you can pay attention to it, you see, oh, that's the threat. Now I have the response. So you can distinguish the exact moment. You can't use time information with the skin conductance. The only thing that you should be sure is to have enough time to observe the response related to your stimulus and to separate stimuli by enough time to not overlap responses. That's the key point. For example, if you send 2 pictures on the screen after 1 second, separated by 1 second, you can't really disentangle which one is generating the response. And that's a problem for your experiment. So you want slow stimuli, let's say.
So if you look at the peak, you can show a picture for 4 seconds and start, let's say, taking into account from second 1, not from 0 to 4, and then have an interval 3 seconds, and then again something like that.
Yeah, but you don't know if you generate the response from as soon as it disappears, for example, also because remember it's an arousal, very raw response that responds to changes of things. So the picture appears on the screen, you always record a response because something happened and okay, I should pay attention. I should pay attention is alert. Alert means I increase the arousal, that means that I increase the response. So I wouldn't suggest this kind of design. I would suggest a design where you show the picture for a certain amount of time that is enough to pay attention to it, and you separate stimuli by enough time to decompose the subsequent. Let's say 1 second is good, so you are sure that you are paying attention to it. But I mean, we don't need one second to see a picture. We saw pictures with a few hundreds of milliseconds. But because of you don't have the precision of the milliseconds in skin conductance, it's not something that you need to be able to provide super fast and precise probes of your pictures. That's the point. It's raw. It's not perfect. It's not useful in every situation. But if you want to measure arousal, the arousal response is a slow response. That's it.
Absolutely out of curiosity. When I study which they try to use as a marker of unconscious perception. So basically, you show something for 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the point. You can have super short. We did it with Elena Nava, with infants, and we used it. It has exactly this way. So the idea is that it's not important how long you show it to generate the response. As soon as you generate an arousal response, you can measure it. But the point is that you may show it for 50 milliseconds. So no conscious, typically not always, but let's say usually you don't have conscious perception for a 50 seconds vision of the picture. But we know that some implicit mechanism already activates, so if it's a very arousal picture, you may have an increased response as compared to neutral stimuli for unconscious perception. So yeah, it works in this way. You don't need long stimulations to have these responses. Yeah.
Out of curiosity.
Yeah.
You have these individual differences, for example, in the amplitude and the duration. Are they somehow related to personality traits, for example?
I don't know. I didn't see any study of this. It would be interesting. But you have also to consider that the inter-individual variability depends on basic features of your, well, the point is that your model could help a lot, but of course nobody used it, because you remove the basically differences from individuals. For example, it depends also on skin biological differences. Okay, so you may have a skin that is more conductive than others because of your genetics that generate the cells of your skin. Okay, that it's totally unrelated to personality and cognition, and that's the biggest effect size for inter-individual variability. So you have to remove all these effects, and it could be very complicated with this kind of data, because it can go from, let's say, the measurement of unit is microsiemens. You can go, normal response can be of 2 microsiemens, the skin conductance level, okay, but also 40. Okay? So it seems on a different scale. And a skin conductance response, so the intra-individual variation of the skin conductance considered as an activation of the autonomous nervous system is a change of 0.02 microsiemens. So you have a change of 40 degrees on inter-individual scale, and a response within the subject that is considered reliable for a change of 1 sense of the brain. Okay, so that's the difficult part. Yeah, it can be. That's why that's one of the last slides. If possible, do within subject experiment. Yeah. Because otherwise, I mean, I don't trust that much between subjects experiment with skin conductance because of this. They have to convince me very well that they take care of all the potential compounds. So, okay, I try to go fast. There is a large, let's say, variability, and another problem is the quick habituation of the response. So if you use constant stimuli, in 15 minutes you have no responses for that stimulus anymore. Also for very strong stimuli, like painful stimuli, if you actually prick a person with always the same intensity, or keep an electrical stimulation, but always with the same intensity, in 15 minutes the response disappears. It's not modulated anymore by anything. So in this case, you have to know it. Because why? Because you just need to change your stimulus sometimes, or just provide some, let's say, filler with stimuli that maybe you don't analyze, but just to avoid the quick habituation, or use a small number of trials of stimuli, because after a few ones, it's not reliable anymore. So you have a general tendency of decreased response over time. You have to take care and consider it. So if you design a within subject experiment, which is better because of the inter-individual variability, it can't be long or use constant stimuli or a lot of constant stimuli, because otherwise you have habituation and it's not reliable anymore again. Okay. So these are stuff that it's better to know, and it's sensitive, of course, to body temperature. Why is this important to know? Because today it's sunny and yesterday was cold, and if we run a between subject and I collect one group today, it's going to have stronger responses than yesterday just because of the weather. So imagine if you are collecting one group that does all the stuff in December and the other group that does all the same, the other condition in July, and you find the effect. Yeah, it changed the season. It's not changed. It's not an effect of your manipulation. So this change, of course, both the lattices and the amplitude. We don't care about the lattices, but we care about the amplitude. And it's age dependent. So older people have smaller response. So I used to do this with stroke patients, measuring skin conductance also in stroke patients, and control groups can be scholars. You have to have same age. Of course, this is true for every experiment, but this is particularly important in these cases. Also considering what you think is good from this measure. So you think it's unmediated, so you don't have the bias, you say, okay, it's an automatic response. It's not because they want to please me, they are my colleagues, they are my friends. Still, they have just different age. So being aware of this. Yes?
So, are there being any attempt of demand effects of this?
Sorry?
A demand effect. We can have a demand experiment, which participants, basically, totally different. Two participants are able to have control.
He only if trained. You can train how to control your physiological reactions.
So they cannot please someone, an experimenter, because they understand what is
No. You can be quite sure about this. You can do what is called biofeedback training. So you give basically feedbacks to train how, and this is both controlling the response to the specific feedback that they receive. So they're not less anxious, they're just able to control the skin conductance. But you can use it to train this. So yeah, you can train, but generally people don't have this skill. Especially for the skin conductance, the heartbeat is a little bit easier to control. At least you can slow a little bit your heartbeat by will. But yeah, skin conductance. And you have intraday fluctuations. So again, consider when you have to balance your randomization that if you are measuring early in the morning, it's different than before going to bed, and before and after lunch is different, and so on. But generally speaking, pay attention to how you assign people to the different groups. And also if you have a within subject design which is better, again, try to make it as short as you can, because otherwise you lose control over these potential compounds. Now the next part is that it's really easy to measure skin conductance. You need a very basic material. You can also build your own node if you are able to do some electrical stuff, because it's a simple amplifier and a transducer that is usually a semi-passive electrode, which means that you have one electrode that sends a very little signal through your skin, and it's received by the other electrodes. So you have, like in this picture, two electrodes on the finger. One is sending the signal, and the other one is receiving it. And the amount of signal that is lost is the I don't remember, sorry, the word. But the idea is that the reciprocal of the amount of signal lost is how much you conduct, and that's the skin conductance. So it's pretty straightforward, the measurement part. And where can you measure it? Well, this is not really important in the sense that I already told you that it's a generalized response for the entire body. So as soon as you have it, you can measure from wherever you want. But there are places where you have these sweat glands more frequently innervating your bodies, and these are places where you want to maximize, you would maximize the response, so it's better. The forehead is the best one, but of course this needs to put two electrodes here, so it's quite intrusive. You have cables in front of the eyes, so maybe it's not the best choice. The hands is very good, it works very well. Feet works very well. Sometimes you want to put on the neck. The key point is that once you decide, the location for your experiment you maintain for all the participants, because if I put the electrodes on the neck or on the finger, that changes the best distribution of the sweat glands, so you will have different conductance just because of biological reasons and not because of different responses. So if you decide to go for hands, go for the hand. Of course, it's not always perfect, but that's the noise measure, good. But you can measure from wherever you want. And this is a nice table in my opinion because it gives you all the different possibilities, and you have the skin conductance level, which is the tone, we said the real measure, and the phasic response. So if you give a stimulus, how much response would you measure? And you see that you can have from foot up to almost 5 microsiemens of variation, which is really a lot. Imagine in my experiments with painful stimuli, so a real prick of the hand or electrical stimulation of the hand, when you have 2 microsiemens, is a huge response. Huge means really that the person in front of you say, okay, can you reduce the intensity? This is a bit too much. Okay, so 5 microsiemens is a lot. What you need is an amplifier, and I put this interesting stuff because you can go from 500 euros, for example, for biofeedback, even less for an amplifier for biofeedback, up to 10,000 euros. And we said it's super simple, the technology that you need. Why is it so? Well, there are a few parameters that you can, a few stuff that you can add to your amplifier. The first one, and it's the most important one, is the gain power. How much gain you can get from the signal, so how much you can amplify basically your signal. And that's something very important because it tells you how sensitive you are from the response. If you have higher numbers, means lower gain. So if you have not enough gain, you may not observe a response just because you are not amplifying the signal enough. We said it's weak electrical response, so you need to amplify it. And that can change and impact very much the cost of your facility. And you can add analogic filters. I won't suggest to use it. We will see later why, but the idea is that if you really need to see the skin conductance response and not the skin conductance level online directly, maybe because you want to use that signal to do a DCI, brain computer interface, or something like that. So you need the skin conductance response in real time. You can have analogic filtering so to have this response, the phasic response, the event-related response online. Again, adding all of these increase the costs, the sampling rate of your machine. We said that skin conductance is a slow response, so sometimes for biofeedback you can have half of hertz of sampling rate frequency, which means 1 sample every 2 seconds. Okay? Why? Because it's enough. It's enough if I just want to see that increase or not. If I don't want to quantify exactly how much. I wouldn't suggest to run an experiment with that. If you want to run an experiment, use at least 100 sampling. If you have problems of memory with your computer devices, use 50 hertz. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very, very light bytes what is generated because typically it's text file with a line for time with the value of the state level, and that's it. So typically, you don't have this problem with 100 hertz, but not all the machines support sampling up to 100 hertz. And yeah, that's what you have to set at the, well, the BioPack is the most famous one. It's brand free, but this is the most famous and the most expensive one. It's very good. We have in our lab in Bicocca. I really would recommend if you have the money to buy it, this is the best one, but it's the most expensive. And most of the cost actually depends on the software that is accompanying the machine, and typically each machine has its own software. And that's another problem. For example, the BioPack is very expensive, the software, because it's the same software for all the psychophysiological measurements that have very different needs of the analysis, and so you have a lot of tools that you will never use that, of course, cost in terms of production and for buying it, while other machines have very simple software that only give back to you a text one line for each sampling and the value of the skin conductance. So how we go from skin conductance level to skin conductance response? We said that we are interested in it. Well, it's super easy. We just need to apply a filter that is a high-pass filter set at 0.05 Hz. There are different methods, but this is the best one. The other method is subtract a grand average, which should give almost the same response, but this is best because we know what we are filtering out. We are filtering out basically very slow cycles, and we get only responses at the frequency rate that are compatible with an event-related response. And so you pass from this line to this line that you see below. And the peak, you will see that corresponds to a peak in the skin conductance level, but in this case we have a 0 because the line tends to go back to 0 after when the filter basically works. Okay? So it tends to go to 0, and the peak is just a response evoked by your stimulus in a time that is compatible with your response, and is a change in the skin conductance response in that time. Yes?
Sorry for a complete ignorance, but what does the high-pass filter do?
High-pass filter basically it removes everything that is, well, high-pass means that only things that have a frequency higher than the filter are kept, and eliminates or the cycles that are lower than it. So if you do a Fourier transformation that gives you the power of the rate of response and how much frequency is there, you basically keep only things that have a 0.05 or above frequency. Below 0.05, so it's lower than 0.05, is not anymore in your signal, is removed.
How can you then have the peaks preserved if the period is more than this?
It's more frequent than 0.05. This is a shorter time, so it's more frequent, the response to reach this peak. It's more frequent. High pass. Everything that is more frequent.
Everything that is more frequent is removed.
Is kept. So if you have you remove everything that cycle, for example, if you go from here to here in 2 seconds, okay, this is removed because it's below the filter threshold. If you go from here to here, sorry, in 2 seconds, this is not something that is evoked, so it's brought to 0 basically. If you go to here, from here to here in 1.5 seconds, it's short enough the time, so it's more frequent. Yeah, I think that's filtering. Okay, so what do you have to do in your experiment typically? Well, you collect the signal at direct current level. That means that you do not apply filters online, if you can, because you can always apply offline digital filters. Then you filter at a high pass of 0.05 to have this basic response. You can polish somehow your signal applying a smoothing, which is a mathematical procedure to remove some of the artifacts, but we don't enter this part. And then after that, you epoch your signal to your stimuli. So after you did all this to your signal, you say, okay, I will consider my time window of 5 seconds post-stimulus because it's where I would take the response, and I pick my peak of interest there. Yeah.
So I was wondering whether someone could think about removing at the individual level as opposed to a nomothetic level. I mean, this is for everyone, for example, as you said before, that you have different kind of level. So I was wondering whether there is also people who are just using individual levels of filtering as opposed to nomothetic level.
The way to do that is using a different method, which is removing the grand mean of the response. So you take the mean of each subject and you remove that. Yeah, I don't suggest it because, again, we are quite aware about the frequencies. So what we are removing are frequencies that we know can't be generated by our stimuli. And so we keep everything, we maximize what we keep, knowing the physiology of the signal. That's why I was saying that it's very important that it has been attracted the attention of the light detection, because we have many basic studies that define this very precise timing, and we know the cycles that are dependent or not from this stuff. So that's why it was important that part of history of skin conductance. And so we know quite well that these filters is not removing something that is related to our signal. Why if we remove the average? Yeah, you remove something that is the average response of the person, so you basically try to do the same, but maybe you remove also some signal that determines you having this kind of average. But that's something that is used. So if you want a more individualized way to remove the basic responses, do it with the mood. So what indices can we measure? We said skin conductance response in terms of peak is very informative and it's useful. And but this is event related. If I have a situation where I want to measure the arousal, for example, in 5 minutes of exposure to a situation, I'm tense because I have to present this stuff, and I want to measure if I am more tense than Giulio, maybe, that we did earlier. It's not very useful because this is a response to one stimulus, and one stimulus of 1 hour and a half is not very good. So there are people that tend to use the skin conductance level, the average of your tone nickel response, but this is not very good because it takes then into account the circadian cycles and the low frequency cycles. So the best way to do it is to basically have this index of spontaneous skin conductance responses. So non-evoked responses that are all the variations in the skin conductance response, so the filtered line, okay, that are not evoked by a specific stimulus that I'm controlling. There are the fluctuations of the individuals within your level of skin conductance, and counting how much responses or the frequency, if you have different timing of these responses, is a good way to have measurements of spontaneous arousal responses for longer times. And this is not something very used, unfortunately, but it's the best way. So, thumb rule for the skin conductance is prepare the participants, means try to standardize as much as you can for the placement of the electrodes. You clean the skin to have the best conductance possible, because during the day you may accumulate some dirt on your skin and make this slow the conductance. Prepare your participants. A decent timing for triggering means that when you have your stimulus, trigger your machine within 1 second to be sure to be able to basically detect the response related to your stimulus. You don't need millisecond precision, but at least second precision, yes. Check to have an appropriate sampling rate. That means, as we said, for experiments, biofeedback tools and machines are not good because typically they have not enough sampling rate to be able to detect the exact peak. That's what we want to observe, not just if you have a change, but how much. So, check for having appropriate sampling rate. Use a moderate number of trials. This is bad. Sometimes you have only one chance to get one trial. For example, in the famous rubber hand illusion, if you want to thread the fake hand, you can do only once, and you measure one trial. That means you need a big sample because we have inter and intra-individual variability, and so you have a lot of noise in your response and a lot of signal. Separate trials of at least 5 seconds, but if you are able, and I recommend to do at least 10, in 5 seconds you are quite sure that you are excluding overlapping responses, but quite is not completely sure. So if you can, separate by 10 seconds, at least. If you do more, better. Vary the stimuli, produce habituation. And if you can, collect this measure at the skin conductance level, so without online filtering, and you filter at the digital level afterwards. There are many softwares. The one that you pay are better than the one for free, but there are also have been developed tools in MATLAB, and it's called ADA Lab, EDA Lab, for doing that. If you have MATLAB, which is not for free, then the work the packaging is for. And yeah, and try to collect the data as fast as you can in terms of not separating your participants by long time to keep all the seasonal changes and the temperature changes as much constant as you can. Of course, it's not perfect, but try to control it as much as you can. Within subject experiment are much better if you can do it. Yes?
All this is about experiments which takes exposure to students.
Yeah.
Couple of things. First, to make it doesn't make a difference whether it's still visual, auditory, or soft, not visual, auditory. Okay. Second question, very important. Can you also do behaviors together? So what I mean is that you system and you have to do so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this doable or you have too much noise to take care of this?
Yeah, good point, Paul. So from the source of stimuli, you can get responses from whatever the sensory stimulation that you want, and also from internal generated stimulation. So if you ask people, okay, imagine something, imagine to be there, or think about, or prepare that, you get the response. Of course, the stronger the stimulation, the stronger the response, because it's an arousal response. So if you do pain, pain generates strong response. If you do other, like a strong sound, noise that attracts your orientation system, it's a strong response. If you show a picture that, yeah, it could be emotional for some people, you get small response. So yes, you can generate whatever the sensory stimulation, but the stronger the stimulus, the stronger the response. And that's what it's interesting, because we know that the peak is related to arousal activation. So we can also compare different kind of stimuli and say, okay, visual stimuli are more arousal than auditive stimuli, for example. We can do it. The other part, yes, you can collect also behaviors. The problem is that you have to put the electrode for the skin conductance on a body part that is not moving, because movements generates artifacts in your skin conductance are on different range of the electrical power. So you can filter out somehow the noise of muscular activities, but I wouldn't recommend to, for example, if you want to press keys with both your hands, don't record from your hands. Just put the electrodes on the neck or on the feet. And that's good.
Suppose it's on the neck.
Yeah.
You have a signal that is not affected.
Yeah, exactly. You have to pay attention on where you put the cables, because if you move the cable, you get noise in your signal. So you have to pay attention how you set up everything. But yes, you can. We always do.
The arousal doesn't interfere, the potential arousal doesn't interfere with potential.
Well, of course, depends on your experiment. If in one condition you have to move and in another one no, then movement may generate an increasing arousal per se, and not because of the specific stimulation, so you have to confound. But if you have to respond, for example, with the left for red light and with the blue for the right one, it's not, the movement is not the problem.
So you can do it in virtual reality?
Yes, of course.
Before you mentioned the fact that even thinking about the movement gets soaked, could it be experiment in which people would not do the movement, but just try instructed to
Yeah, when I said it before, it was about the electromyographic activity, so it's a different index. But generally speaking, yes, you can ask people just to imagine to do things, and this generates response. Of course, again, the stronger the arousal activation, the stronger the response. So if my request is to imagine, unfortunately, a worse situation, maybe I get a strong response just for imagination. Okay? If I ask people to imagine to have a walk along the lake, it's beautiful, but it's not arousal, so I won't get any response.
But I was thinking that I'm interested in virtual reality. So if I want to see this reaction, with the stimulus, the stimulus negative, I want to see if the person, how the person reacts if she has to approach it and thinking about approaching it. What would you suggest is better, that I ask them to do the real movement or just think about it?
I would suggest to do the movement just because it's not affecting your recording. If you choose a specific a good point for measurement. That means that you would also have the overt response, so you can be sure about what they want to do, and you don't have to rely on the compliance of your participants and trust that he or she did exactly what you asked. So it's a different reason why we choose to do actually the movement, not because you don't have skin conductance generation, but because you can check that the compliance of your participants to the task. So it's unrelated to the skin conductance. The point of your question is that this is measuring arousal, which affect both approach and avoidance. So if you want to discriminate between approaching and avoidance response, you can do it with the skin conductance because both elicits the arousal response.
That's maybe I was thinking about the related one.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that if you want to distinguish between an approach response or an avoidance response, skin conductance don't tell you this. Tell you only, okay, you've been aroused, so you could react in approach or in an avoidance way. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is. So I think we have to run for a bit for the heart rate, but because we have 10 minutes. But it's good. We have to run, it's increasing the heart rate. But luckily, because I'm less prepared on the heart rate than on the skin conductance. So the idea is that you can have different indices, as we said. The heartbeat is more complex in few senses than the skin conductance, also in terms of signal. What is it? Of course, is the electrical activity generated by the activation, the working of your heart. This is related, this has this specific pattern, and maybe you saw in many films that they always have this nice, beautiful line that show you your heartbeat. And basically you have this line that relates to the different activities of your heart. And what you are interested in basically in detecting this QRS complex, because the R is very, how to say, specific and easily detectable in your electrical signal, while the P and T not always. You're interested in the R just because it's easier to detect the frequency, because it's very precise, the QRS complex, and not because you're not interested in the other parts. Also, the others reflects the rhythm of your heartbeat, but they are less reliably detectable in your signal. So the idea is that you catch this complex and you capture the frequency. How to record it? There are different ways. If you have ever done a medical examination for sports, you probably had these heart measurements, also for medical reasons maybe. But if you do it for sports, they don't touch you just 3 electrodes, but many more, and on the chest, because it's the best way to capture it, of course. But if you don't really need to have super precise measurements to capture problems with the P or PR or T components, just catch the R. You just need 3 electrodes that makes this triangulation that includes the heart in between. So you can put 1 electrode on one wrist, another one on the other one, and the reference electrode as far as you can from these 2. So, for example, for the feet. Okay? So you can put on the 2 shoulders and 1 on the feet. It's good. Okay? Once you have this pattern, you are able to detect the QRS complex quite easily. And if you want to do other measurements with electrical signal like electromyography, sometimes you have this intrusive response of the heartbeat. If you don't pay attention where you put the electrodes, you capture heart activity instead of muscular activity because it's easily detectable, basically. So sometimes you don't want and you find the heart. Again, you have few parameters to set in your machines, depends on the machine of course, but typically you have a gain parameter. The lower the number means higher gain, which means more signal and more noise in your trace. So if you have a good situation, this really depends on your machine. Sometimes machines are very good, you don't need a high gain because they are very sensitive and they are being done very well in the capture. Your electrodes are super reliable, good. Otherwise, you have to increase the gain, which means bring noise in your measure. but that's a machine-dependent stuff. And again, as much as you can, use the non-filtered signal, because you can always apply digital filters, and so you lose less information. If you apply an analog filter, you cannot go back to the original signal. What you measure with the heart rate, typically you measure two indices. Heart rate frequency, which is beat per minute, basically, and how fast your heart beats, or more interesting, the heart rate variability, which is quite complex. We will see this one. The heart rate in frequency is the distance between two heart components, and you calculate your frequency per minute, basically, and you say, okay, your heart is going 70 beats per minute. That's it. You can calculate the frequency, the differences, whatever you want with the signal. But that's just that, okay? And many experiments does it. It's good. I wouldn't recommend it, since we have the heart rate variability indices, which transform basically the RR interval in terms of variability and in terms of frequency power. So what we said before, speaking of filtering out different frequency levels, you can do it with the frequency power of the heart rate, which is quite slow, because even if you have a very fast beat, I mean, if you are not very highly stimulated, you won't surpass the 90 beats per minute. It's a lot, 90. So it's 1.5 hertz as fast as you can reach in natural situation. You can go up to 2.5, but not more. So once you transform in this different frequency, we have 4 different bands of frequency that we are quite aware of what do they mean. And we have the ultra low frequency band that are not related to central nervous system activity, except that it tells you if you are alive or not. Really. You still have heartbeats when you die somehow. You could still have heartbeats and you are dead, clinical death. Okay? You are in a situation where it's just basic activities of current. Yes, check it. But you have to do a Fourier transformation to understand. Then you have very low frequency bands, which start to be interesting. As you can see here, they are associated also with death, but also with post-traumatic stress disease, a change in this frequency band. And that means that could be related to autonomous nervous system activation. And we saw from the beginning that the heartbeat is innervated both by parasympathetic and sympathetic system. And you can somehow, using this information from the different bands, we know that some bands are more related to parasympathetic and others to sympathetic. So you can, with the heart measurement, the heart rate variability measure, somehow measure the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activity, which is very good and something that you cannot do with the skin conductance. What's the drawback? You see here. This super low frequency can't be a period that requires at least 5 minutes. That means that if you don't record 5 minutes of signal, you can't observe this. That means that if you record 10 minutes of signal, you have 2 cycles. Okay, 2 cycles. You can't really estimate the power of this. So this means that you need a 24 hours observation. That means that it's not very useful in typical lab experiment where you have event-related response. And that's, we can stop here, because in the sense that heart rate variability measure is not a good measure for evoked response experiments. Even if sometimes you see, because of the next slide, it's not. Simply you are not really measuring heart rate variability if you don't have enough observation. Then you have the low frequency band. It's at least 2 minutes, but please do it more. So if you are interested only in the low frequency and the high frequency band, you can have experiment with 10 minutes of observation, and this could be something more lab-like experiments, and sometimes it's done in this way, but you are missing the information from the very low frequency band that are related to central nervous activation. So you have these two bands, the high frequency band that is also interesting because it's related to the breath rhythm, and that also tells you that if you really want to measure heart rate variability, you also have to measure breath rhythm to remove the confounds of breath rate from the high frequency band. Now we have digital way to estimate the breath rate, so you can have an approximation without a good approximation without measuring actually the breath rate, but it's better if you can measure both. So the recommendations are basically the same because of the skin conductance, because you still measure weak electrical signals, so prepare the subject, try to have as much as you can constant condition to record it. And Dropbox, we already discussed it, is useless for evoked stimulus response experiments. It's completely useless. And guidelines suggest at least 5 minutes of epochs because you can measure at least low frequency band and high frequency band, but you miss the ultra low that are not interesting, but also the very low that are interesting. And it's better if you control for the breath rate. So that's it. The conclusions are they useful psychophysiological measurements? I think yes. The take-home message is yes, but you have to be aware of what you are measuring because many times, really in my experience, many times, because they are easy to collect, people just attach the electrodes and collect the skin conductance level and then comes to you and say, okay, what can I do now? Nothing. I mean, nothing, really nothing. You can, empty the space of your hard drive now. That's a good way to use it. But if you think of an experiment, so in my opinion, it shouldn't be used as a side measure. You have to think of your experiment to measure it because they have specific needs. That doesn't fit all the experiments that you want to design. If you do so, they are useful because they really have this good value of measuring arousal in a reliable way. We know what we measure with the peak response, and we really measure without asking anything to our participants, and it works. It works in this way. But please pay attention to what you do because otherwise it can be complicated. And the side part is that it's relatively cheap. In the world of the neuroscience, you can have the super best machine. It can go up to, let's say, 15,000 euros, which are 15 participants in an MRI scan. Okay, so it's still a cheap machine as compared to others. It's, of course, it depends if you have the possibility to have one, but yeah, it's quite, I would say that most of the time you can somehow access one of these systems. And that's it.